The mare's legs buckled beneath her, just as the sun reached its merciless peak over the Utah desert. And Josephine Bailey knew with cold certainty that she was about to die out here alone. She had been riding hard for 3 days straight, pushing the chestnut mare beyond what any animal should endure. But desperation had a way of making people cruel even to the creatures they loved. The horse collapsed with a pitiful whinny that would haunt Josephine for the rest of her life, however long that might be, and lay on its side in the red dust, flanks heaving irregularly. Josephine dismounted quickly, her boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud, and knelt beside the animal that had carried her faithfully from Santa Fe all the way through this God-forsaken stretch between the Colorado River and Moab. "I'm sorry," she whispered, running her hand along the mare's sweat-soaked neck. "I'm so sorry, girl. I pushed you too hard." The horse's dark eyes seemed to understand, seemed almost to forgive, which made it worse somehow. Josephine had been running from a marriage arranged by her father to a cattle baron twice her age, a man whose first 2 wives had died under mysterious circumstances that the law never seemed interested in investigating. At 23 years old, she had decided that dying in the desert was preferable to becoming the 3rd Mrs. Augustus Thornton. Now, watching her horse struggle for each breath, she wondered if she had made the right choice. She pulled her canteen from the saddle, noting with growing dread that perhaps 2 swallows of water remained. The mare shuddered once, twice, and then went still. Josephine sat beside the dead animal for a long moment, feeling the heat press down on her like a physical weight. Her dark hair clung to her neck beneath her wide-brimmed hat, and her calico dress was stained with dust and salt from dried sweat. She supposed she should stand up, should try to walk, should do something other than sit here waiting for the vultures she could already see circling overhead. But what was the point? Moab was still at least 15 miles to the northeast, maybe more. She had no horse, almost no water, and the temperature had to be approaching 100 degrees. The terrain stretched out before her in endless waves of red rock and scrub brush, beautiful in its way but utterly inhospitable to a woman on foot. "Well," she said aloud to the empty desert, "I suppose this is what independence looks like." She forced herself to stand, retrieving what few supplies she could carry from the saddle. A bedroll, the near-empty canteen, a small pouch containing $17.30, everything she owned in the world. She had a Derringer with 2 shots tucked into her boot, not that it would do much good against dehydration or exposure. Josephine took one last look at the mare, whispered another apology, and began walking north. The first hour was not so terrible. She found a sort of rhythm, counting her steps to pass the time, trying not to think about the water or the heat, or the fact that she had not seen another living soul in 2 days. The landscape rolled by in shades of rust and ochre, dotted with juniper trees that offered precious little shade. Her feet ached in her boots, which had been made for riding, not walking. The second hour was worse. The sun seemed to have grown larger somehow, swallowing the sky. Josephine finished the water in her canteen and immediately regretted it, knowing she should have rationed it better. Her lips were already cracking, her tongue beginning to feel thick in her mouth. She thought about her mother, dead these 10 years, and wondered if they would be reunited soon. She thought about her father, who had cared more about the business arrangement with Thornton than his own daughter's happiness or safety, and felt a surge of anger that briefly eclipsed her fear. By the 3rd hour, she was stumbling more than walking. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, but that brought little relief. She knew the desert got cold at night and she had no way to make a fire. Perhaps she should simply lie down, close her eyes, and let it end. It would not take long. That was when she heard the hoofbeats. At first, Josephine thought it was a hallucination, the desert playing tricks on her addled mind. But the sound grew steadily louder, and when she turned around, shading her eyes with her hand, she could make out a figure on horseback approaching from the south, the same direction she had come from. For a wild moment, she feared it might be someone sent by Thornton to retrieve his runaway bride. But as the rider drew closer, she could see this was not one of Thornton's men in their fancy clothes and polished boots. This was a cowboy in every sense of the word. He sat tall in the saddle atop a sturdy-looking buckskin gelding, dressed in worn denim pants and a faded blue shirt with a leather vest. His hat had seen better days, shaped by weather and use, and a red bandana was tied around his neck. Even from a distance, Josephine could see he moved with the easy grace of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback. As he came closer, she could make out more details. He was young, probably not more than 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin, and several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. His eyes, she noticed as he reined in the buckskin a few feet from where she stood swaying, were a striking shade of green. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and unhurried with a slight Texas drawl. "You appear to be in some difficulty." Josephine wanted to laugh at the understatement, but her throat was too dry. "My horse died," she managed to croak. "Back there. 3 hours' walk, maybe." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and pulled a canteen from his saddle. He uncapped it and handed it to her without hesitation. "Drink slow," he advised. "I know you want to gulp it down, but you will just make yourself sick." She took the canteen with shaking hands and did as he said, though it took every ounce of willpower she possessed not to drain the whole thing. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, and it was the most glorious thing she had ever experienced. She forced herself to take just a few swallows before handing it back. "Thank you," she said, and her voice already sounded stronger. "I thought I was going to die out here." "You probably were," he said matter-of-factly, surveying her with those keen green eyes. "No offense, madam, but you are not exactly outfitted for desert travel on foot. Where are you headed?" "Moab," Josephine said. "I was trying to reach Moab," he nodded slowly. "That is where I am headed as well. Town is about 12 miles from here, give or take. You would not have made it by nightfall, even if you had water." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him working through some internal calculation. Then he turned and began untying his bedroll from behind his saddle. "What are you doing?" Josephine asked. "Getting my gear together," he said. "You are going to take Artemis here to Moab. I will walk." Josephine stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I cannot take your horse. How will you get to town?" "On foot," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I have water. I know the terrain, and I am not half dead from exposure." "You are. Artemis is a good horse and will get you to Moab safe." He pronounced it Artemis with that Texas drawl, and despite everything, Josephine found herself noticing what a pleasant voice he had. "But that is insane," she protested. "You cannot just give me your horse. What if I steal him? You do not even know me." The cowboy looked at her with something that might have been amusement playing around his mouth. "Madam, no offense, but you look like you can barely stand, let alone steal a horse. And even if you did, well, I reckon that is a risk I am willing to take." He finished securing his bedroll and saddlebags across his shoulders and back, loaded down like a pack mule. "Name is Hayes Dalton, by the way. Figured you should know who you are stealing from." "Josephine Bailey," she said automatically. "And I am not stealing your horse. This is ridiculous. We can ride together." Hayes shook his head. "Artemis has been carrying me and my gear all the way from Wyoming." He is tired, and doubling up in this heat would be too much for him. You are lighter than me, and you need to get to town faster than I do. It is the sensible solution." "Sensible," Josephine repeated incredulously. "There is nothing sensible about walking 12 miles through the desert when you have a perfectly good horse." "There is nothing sensible about a woman dying when I could have prevented it," Hayes countered. He gathered up Artemis's reins and held them out to her. "Look, Miss Bailey, we can stand here arguing until the sun goes down and we both end up spending a cold night in the desert, or you can accept my help and be in Moab in a few hours. Which sounds better to you?" Josephine looked at the reins, at the horse, at Hayes Dalton's sunburned face with its expression of patient determination. She thought about pride and about survival, about the fact that she had already sacrificed her own horse in her desperate flight from Santa Fe. What was one more debt to add to the pile? "This is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me," she said quietly, taking the reins. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton." "Hayes," he corrected. "And you are welcome. Now you remember how to get to Moab from here." "Follow the trail north until I hit the river, then follow the river east into town," Josephine recited. She had studied the route extensively before fleeing Santa Fe, had memorized every landmark and water source. "That is right. Artemis knows the way too if you get confused. Just give him his head and he will take you there." Hayes stepped back and gestured toward the stirrup. "Best get moving. You want to make town before dark." Josephine put her boot in the stirrup, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. Her legs trembled as she pulled herself up into the saddle, and she had to grip the horn to steady herself. The buckskin stood patient beneath her, and she could feel the solid strength of the animal, the warmth of its body. Alive, not like her poor mare lying dead in the dust miles behind them. "Hayes," she said, looking down at him. He had already started to turn away, ready to begin his long walk. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me. I could be a criminal for all you know." He looked up at her, and the late afternoon sun caught in his eyes, turning them almost gold. "Maybe," he said, "but I do not think so. You have honest eyes, Miss Bailey, even if you do have secrets." He touched the brim of his hat again. "Safe travels. I will see you in Moab." Before she could respond, he set off walking north with long, steady strides, his bedroll and bags bouncing slightly on his back. Josephine sat in the saddle watching him for a moment, this strange cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere and given her his horse like it was nothing. Then she nudged Artemis forward, following the trail north just as Hayes had directed. The ride to Moab took just under 3 hours. Josephine was right about the buckskin knowing the way. Whenever she became uncertain at a fork in the trail, she would simply loosen the reins and let the horse choose, and he always seemed to know which direction to go. The landscape gradually shifted from empty desert to something more hospitable. She spotted the green ribbon of the Colorado River in the distance as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple, and her heart lifted despite her exhaustion. By the time she rode into Moab, full darkness had fallen. The town was small, maybe 400 souls at most, but to Josephine it looked like paradise. She could see the warm glow of oil lamps in windows, could hear the tinny sound of a piano coming from one of the saloons. She directed Artemis toward what appeared to be a hotel and livery stable at the far end of the main street. A man emerged from the livery as she approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and a weathered face. "Help you, miss?" "I need a room and boarding for this horse," Josephine said, her voice hoarse. "The horse belongs to Hayes Dalton. He is walking behind me, should arrive sometime tomorrow." The old man's eyebrows rose. "Hayes Dalton, from up Wyoming way, he gave you his horse." "He did," Josephine confirmed. "I was stranded when my own horse died. He insisted I take his. The old man let out a low whistle. That sounds like Hayes, all right. Known that boy since he was knee-high. His daddy used to run cattle through here regular. He reached up to help her dismount, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled. Name is Roy Creston. I run this place. Let me get this horse settled, then we will get you fixed up with a room and some supper. You look half-starved. I am fine, Josephine started to say, but her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough for Roy to hear. He chuckled. Sure you are, miss. Come on. Within an hour, Josephine found herself in a small but clean room above the livery, with a basin of water for washing and a plate of stew and cornbread that Roy's wife Martha had sent up. She ate mechanically, too tired to really taste the food, then washed as best she could and fell into bed still wearing her underclothes. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of Hayes Dalton walking through the darkness, loaded down with gear, having given up his horse for a complete stranger. She woke late the next morning to bright sunlight streaming through the single window. For a moment she could not remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back. The horse dying, Hayes appearing like some avenging angel, the ride to Moab. She sat up quickly, wincing at the soreness in her legs and back, and looked around for her dress. Someone, probably Martha, had come in while she slept and taken it, because it now hung cleaned and pressed on a hook by the door. In its place on the chair was a note written in neat script. Your dress was in need of washing. Breakfast is available downstairs until noon. You slept through supper last night and most of this morning. Room is paid for 3 nights. Roy. Josephine looked at the note, feeling a lump form in her throat. 3 nights. She did not have enough money for 3 nights in a hotel, which meant someone else had paid. Hayes, probably, or at least he had made arrangements before starting his trek to Moab. She dressed quickly, ran her fingers through her tangled hair in a futile attempt to make herself presentable, and headed downstairs. The dining room was small, just 4 tables, but it was bright and cheerful with yellow curtains at the windows. Martha Creston emerged from what Josephine assumed was the kitchen, carrying a pot of coffee. She was a pleasantly round woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. There you are, dear, she said warmly. We were starting to worry. Sit down, I will bring you some eggs and bacon. Thank you, Josephine said, taking a seat at one of the tables. Mrs. Creston, the note said the room is paid for 3 nights. I cannot accept that. I have some money. Martha waved her hand dismissively. That was all arranged. You just focus on getting your strength back. You look like you have been through the wars. She disappeared into the kitchen before Josephine could protest further. Josephine sat in the quiet dining room, feeling strange and unmoored. For weeks, she had been running, looking over her shoulder, terrified that Thornton or his men would catch up to her. Now, suddenly, she was safe in this small town, drinking coffee in a sunny room while someone made her breakfast. It felt almost dreamlike. The door to the street opened, and Josephine looked up, half hoping to see Hayes. Instead, a young woman about her own age entered, dressed in a practical brown dress with her blonde hair pinned up in a simple bun. She had the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors, and she surveyed the room with sharp blue eyes before spotting Josephine. You must be the woman Roy told me about, she said, coming over to the table. The one Hayes Dalton rescued. I am Josephine Bailey, Josephine said. Though I am not sure rescued is the right word. What would you call it when a man gives you his horse and walks 12 miles through the desert? The woman asked with a slight smile. She held out her hand. I am Sarah Kemp. I run the general store here in town. Josephine shook her hand. Pleased to meet you, Miss Kemp. Sarah, please. And it is Mrs. technically, though my husband passed 2 years ago, pneumonia. She said it matter-of-factly without seeking sympathy. "Mind if I sit? I have been on my feet since dawn." "Please do," Josephine said. Martha emerged with a plate of eggs and bacon, saw Sarah, and went back for another cup of coffee without needing to be asked. Clearly, Sarah was a regular. "So," Sarah said once Martha had delivered the coffee and returned to the kitchen, "what brings you to Moab?" "Besides a dead horse and a good Samaritan cowboy, I mean." Josephine hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Sarah seemed friendly enough, but she was still a stranger, and Josephine had learned the hard way to be cautious. On the other hand, she was going to need allies if she planned to stay in Moab for any length of time, and something about Sarah's direct manner inspired trust. "I was running away from an arranged marriage," she said finally, "to a man in Santa Fe. I would rather not go into details, but staying was not an option." Sarah nodded slowly. "And does this man know where you are?" "I do not think so," Josephine said. "I told no one where I was going, but he has resources and connections. Eventually, he might think to look for me here." "Well," Sarah said, taking a sip of her coffee, "if you need work, I could use help in the store. The pay is not much, but it would be enough for room and board. And if anyone comes looking for a woman matching your description, people in this town know how to keep their mouths shut, especially if that woman is one of our own." Josephine felt that lump in her throat again. "You do not even know me. Why would you help me?" "Because you look like you need help," Sarah said simply. "And because I remember what it was like to be desperate and scared. Besides, any woman brave enough or desperate enough to cross the desert alone is probably worth knowing." She stood up, draining the last of her coffee. "Think about the job offer. The store is 2 doors down from here, the building with the blue trim. Stop by if you are interested." After Sarah left, Josephine sat finishing her breakfast and thinking. She had planned to keep moving, maybe head north to Salt Lake City or west to California. But her money would not last much longer, and she was so tired of running. Maybe it would not hurt to stay in Moab for a little while, just until she figured out her next move. And she could not deny that part of her wanted to see Hayes Dalton again, to thank him properly for what he had done. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the town. Moab was small but surprisingly well established for a frontier settlement. In addition to the hotel and general store, there was a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church, a doctor's office, and a handful of other businesses. The town sat in a valley surrounded by spectacular red rock formations, with the Colorado River providing water and serving as a transportation route. Most of the residents seemed to be ranchers, farmers, or prospectors hoping to strike it rich in the nearby canyons. Josephine stopped by the general store in the early afternoon. Sarah was behind the counter, tallying up purchases for an older woman who was buying flour and sugar. She looked up when Josephine entered and smiled. "Decided to take me up on the offer, if it is still available," Josephine said. "I would be grateful for the work." "Good," Sarah said. "Can you start tomorrow? I open at 7, but you can come by at 8. That should give you time to settle in properly." They spent the next hour discussing wages, hours, and the general running of the store. Sarah explained that business was steady if not spectacular, serving the local population and the occasional traveler passing through on the way to somewhere else. She needed help with inventory, serving customers, and keeping the accounts, all things Josephine felt reasonably confident she could do. Her father had insisted she receive an education, even if he had ultimately cared more about marrying her off for business advantage than about what she wanted. Josephine was walking back to the hotel as the sun began to sink toward the western horizon when she saw him. Hayes Dalton was trudging up the main street, dusty and weary but still on his feet. His hat hung down his back by the stampede string, and his dark brown hair was plastered to his head with sweat. Even exhausted and filthy, there was something compelling about him, something solid and dependable. She ran toward him without thinking. "Hayes, you made it." He looked up, and when he saw her, his tired face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his features. "Miss Bailey, I am glad to see you made it safely." "Thanks to you," Josephine said. She suddenly felt awkward, unsure what to say to this man who had saved her life. "Your horse is at the livery. Roy Creston has been taking care of him." "Good old Roy," Hayes said. He shifted his gear, and Josephine could see the strain in his shoulders. He had been walking for the better part of 24 hours, probably with only brief stops to rest. "You look exhausted," she said. "Have you eaten?" "Not since yesterday," he admitted. "But I will get something once I have seen to Artemis and cleaned up." "Let me buy you dinner," Josephine blurted out. "Please, it is the least I can do after what you did for me." Hayes looked like he was going to refuse, but then he seemed to reconsider. "That would be kind of you, Miss Bailey. Let me just get settled first." An hour," Josephine agreed. "I am staying at the hotel above the livery." "I know," Hayes said. "I made arrangements with Roy before I set out from where we met. Figured you would need a place to stay, and Roy owes my father a few favors." Of course he had. Josephine watched him continue toward the livery, feeling something warm unfurl in her chest. She had known Hayes Dalton for less than 24 hours, and he had already shown her more genuine kindness than most people she had known her entire life. True to his word, Hayes appeared at the hotel dining room an hour later, transformed by soap and water. He had shaved the road dust and stubble from his jaw, revealing a strong bone structure and a small scar on his chin. His hair was still damp and neatly combed, and he had changed into clean clothes, a white shirt and dark pants that fit him well. Josephine felt her breath catch slightly. Without the grime of travel, Hayes Dalton was remarkably handsome. "Miss Bailey," he said, spotting her at one of the tables. "I hope I did not keep you waiting." "Not at all," she said. "And please call me Josephine. I think you have earned that right." "Only if you call me Hayes," he said, taking the seat across from her. Martha appeared with her perpetual coffee pot and 2 menus written in chalk on small slates. "Well, Hayes Dalton," Martha said warmly. "I heard you were in town. How is your father?" "Doing well, Mrs. Creston, thank you for asking," Hayes said. "He is still running the ranch up in Wyoming, though he is talking about maybe retiring in a few years." "Tell him Roy and I said hello," Martha said. "Now, what can I get you two for supper?" They ordered pot roast and vegetables, and Martha bustled away, leaving them alone. For a moment neither spoke, and then Hayes said, "So you are planning to stay in Moab for a while?" "For a bit," Josephine said. "Sarah Kemp offered me work in her store. I figured I could use the money and the rest." Hayes nodded. "Sarah is good people. Her husband was a friend of mine. His death was hard on her, but she has managed well." He paused, then said carefully, "Can I ask why you were out in the desert alone? You said you were heading to Moab, but that is a long way from anywhere. Most people do not make that journey solo." Josephine looked down at her hands, debating how much to say. But Hayes had given her his horse, had walked through the desert for her. He deserved some honesty. "I was running away from an arranged marriage. My father wanted me to marry a wealthy man in Santa Fe, but that man is dangerous. His previous wives died under suspicious circumstances. I decided I would rather take my chances alone than end up as wife number 3. Hayes's expression darkened. "Your father wanted you to marry a man he knew was dangerous. He cared more about the business connections than my safety," Josephine said bitterly. "I am his only child, but I think he saw me more as a commodity than a daughter." "That is a hell of a thing," Hayes said quietly. "No wonder you ran. Does this man know where you are? "I do not think so," Josephine said, "but he is not the type to let things go easily. He might send people to look for me." "Well, if he does, he will have to go through the people of Moab," Hayes said, "and I can promise you we take care of our own here." "I am not one of your own," Josephine pointed out. "I just arrived yesterday." Hayes met her eyes, and there was something intense in his gaze that made her pulse quicken. "Maybe not yet, but I have a feeling you will be." Dinner arrived, and they talked more easily as they ate. Hayes told her about his family's ranch in Wyoming, about growing up on horseback and learning the cattle business from his father. He had been down in Utah Territory looking at some land his father was thinking of purchasing, scouting out water sources and grazing potential. Josephine told him about growing up in Santa Fe, about her mother's death when she was 13, about learning to ride because it was the one thing that made her feel free. "Your father let you learn to ride?" Hayes asked, surprised. "He did not see the harm in it," Josephine said. "He thought it was a harmless pastime, something to keep me occupied. He did not realize it would be what saved me in the end." "Until your horse died," Hayes said softly. "Yes," Josephine said. "Until then. I pushed her too hard, trying to put distance between me and Santa Fe. I will regret that for the rest of my life." Hayes reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. The touch was warm and solid and sent an unexpected jolt through her. "You did what you had to do to survive. That mare understood, I reckon. Animals know when things are desperate." They lingered over coffee after the meal was finished, neither seeming eager to end the evening. Hayes told her stories about life on the range, about cattle drives and stampedes and sleeping under the stars. Josephine found herself laughing for the first time in weeks, enchanted by his easy humor and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Finally, as full darkness settled over Moab and Martha began pointedly clearing tables around them, Hayes stood. "I should let you get some rest. You have been through an ordeal. You walked 12 miles through the desert," Josephine reminded him. "I think you are the one who needs rest." "True enough," he admitted, "but I am used to it. You are not." He hesitated, then said, "I am planning to stay in Moab for a few days before I head back north. Would it be all right if I called on you again? Maybe showed you around town properly?" Josephine felt warmth spread through her chest. "I would like that very much." Hayes smiled, that transformative expression that lit up his whole face. "Good. Then I will see you tomorrow, Josephine Bailey." He touched the brim of his hat to her and headed out into the night, leaving Josephine sitting alone in the dining room with her heart beating faster than it had any right to. Over the next few days, a pattern developed. Josephine would work at Sarah's store from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, learning the inventory and serving the steady stream of customers. She discovered she had a knack for the work, for remembering what people needed and making conversation that put them at ease. Sarah proved to be an excellent employer, patient and fair, and Josephine felt her confidence growing with each passing day. In the evenings, Hayes would appear at the store just as she was closing up, and they would walk together through Moab streets, talking about everything and nothing. He showed her the best spot to watch the sunset paint the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson. He took her to meet the local doctor, a gruff man named Patterson, who nevertheless seemed kind beneath his rough exterior. They visited the blacksmith, a massive German immigrant named Klaus who made Hayes promise to bring Artemis by for new shoes before heading back to Wyoming. And they talked. Lord, how they talked. Josephine could not remember the last time she had felt so comfortable with another person, so able to speak her mind without fear of judgment. Hayes listened when she spoke about her dreams of maybe one day owning her own business, about wanting to make a life on her own terms. He did not laugh or tell her it was impossible. He just nodded and said he thought she would be good at whatever she set her mind to. For his part, Hayes told her about the loneliness of life on a remote ranch, about losing his mother to influenza when he was 15, about the complicated relationship he had with his father, whom he loved but did not always understand. He talked about his dreams of maybe one day having his own spread, something smaller and more manageable than his father's vast holdings. "I want something I can build myself," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch outside the general store, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "My father has been generous, do not misunderstand, but I want to know that what I have, I earned with my own hands and my own sweat." "I understand that," Josephine said. "I think that is why I left Santa Fe in a way. If I had married Thornton, I would have had wealth and security, but none of it would have been mine. I would have just been an extension of him, a possession." Hayes looked at her, and even in the dim light she could see the admiration in his eyes. "You are very brave, Josephine, braver than most men I know." "I was terrified," she admitted. "I am still terrified, honestly. Terrified that he will find me, that I will not be able to make it on my own, that I made a terrible mistake leaving everything I knew." "But you did it anyway," Hayes said. "That is what courage is, not the absence of fear but acting despite it." They sat in companionable silence for a while, and then Hayes said, "Can I ask you something personal?" "After everything, I think you have earned that right," Josephine said. "You have any regrets? About leaving, I mean." Josephine thought about it seriously. "I regret my horse dying. I regret that I did not stand up to my father sooner. But leaving?" She shook her head. "No. Even if I had died out there in the desert, I think it would have been better than the alternative. At least I would have died free." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I am glad you did not die out there in the desert or anywhere else." Josephine looked at him, at his profile silhouetted against the darkening sky, and felt something shift inside her. "I am glad too, though not just for my own sake." Hayes turned to face her, and the air between them suddenly felt charged, electric. "No, no," Josephine said softly. "If I had died out there, I never would have met you, Hayes Dalton, and that would have been a shame." For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. She could see the want in his eyes, could feel the tension thrumming between them. But then he pulled back slightly, and the moment passed. "I should get you back to the hotel," he said, standing and offering her his hand. "Sarah will have my hide if I keep you out too late and you are not fresh for work tomorrow." Josephine took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, trying not to feel disappointed. What had she expected? They had only known each other for a few days. But it felt longer somehow, as if Hayes Dalton had been part of her life for years rather than mere days. On Friday evening, 5 days after Josephine had arrived in Moab, Hayes appeared at the general store with a troubled expression. Josephine was sweeping up after closing, and she set the broom aside immediately when she saw his face. "What is wrong?" "I got a telegram from my father today," Hayes said. "There is trouble at the ranch. One of his foremen was injured in an accident, and he needs me back to help manage things until the man recovers. I have to leave tomorrow morning." Josephine felt her stomach drop, which was absurd. She had known Hayes would have to leave eventually. He had his own life, his own responsibilities. But somehow, in just 5 days, she had grown so accustomed to his presence that the thought of Moab without him felt wrong. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Your father needs you." "I do not want to go," Hayes said, and there was frustration in his voice. "Or rather, I do, because it is my father and he needs help, but I do not want to leave you." Josephine's heart stuttered. "Hayes, I know it has only been a few days," he said, taking a step toward her. "I know that is not long enough to really know a person. But Josephine, I feel like I have known you much longer. These past few days, talking with you, getting to know you, it has been the best time I have had in as long as I can remember. And the thought of going back to Wyoming and not seeing you every evening, it sits wrong with me. It sits wrong with me too, Josephine admitted. But Wyoming is a long way from Utah, and we both have lives we need to live. Hayes closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just inches away. So this is goodbye. I suppose it is, Josephine said, and hated how thick her voice sounded. Hayes reached up and gently cupped her face in his hand, his palm warm against her cheek. I am going to come back, Josephine Bailey. As soon as things are settled at the ranch, I am going to come back to Moab, and I am going to court you properly, the way you deserve. If you will let me, that is. Josephine felt tears prick at her eyes. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to, Hayes said. I want to. These past few days, you have become important to me. More important than I knew a person could become in such a short time. I need to know that I am going to see you again. You will, Josephine said. I am not going anywhere. I like Moab. I like the work at the store, and I like the people here. And she took a breath. I like you, Hayes, more than like maybe. The smile that spread across Hayes's face was like sunrise. Yeah, Josephine said, feeling her own lips curve in response, and then finally Hayes Dalton kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss, not a reckless one. It was sweet and gentle and full of promise, the kind of kiss that spoke of beginnings rather than endings. His lips were warm against hers, and when he pulled back, Josephine felt dizzy. I will write, Hayes said, resting his forehead against hers. Every week, I promise. You better, Josephine said, trying to lighten the moment even as her heart ached. I will be waiting. Hayes left early the next morning before the sun had fully risen over the red rocks. Josephine stood outside the livery and watched him ride out on Artemis, turning once to wave before disappearing around a bend in the trail. She stayed there long after he was gone, feeling the cool morning air on her face and trying not to cry. He will be back, Sarah said from behind her. Josephine had not heard her approach. I have known Hayes Dalton since he was a boy. When that man makes a promise, he keeps it. I hope so, Josephine said. I know so, Sarah said firmly. She put an arm around Josephine's shoulders. Now come on. We have a store to open, and moping about will not make the time pass any faster. Sarah was right about that, at least. The days developed a new rhythm. Josephine threw herself into her work at the general store, expanding her responsibilities and learning every aspect of the business. Sarah, recognizing her dedication and skill, gradually gave her more and more autonomy. By the end of Josephine's second week in Moab, she was handling most of the day-to-day operations while Sarah focused on managing accounts and ordering new inventory. Hayes's first letter arrived 10 days after he left. Josephine recognized his handwriting on the envelope immediately, and she carried it upstairs to her room before opening it, wanting privacy to read his words. The letter was 3 pages long, written in Hayes's neat, precise hand. He told her about his journey back to Wyoming, about the injured foreman who was recovering slowly but surely, about the work that was piling up on the ranch. But mostly, he wrote about missing her. I find myself thinking of you at odd moments, he had written. When I am riding fence line or checking on cattle, when I am eating supper and remember how you laughed at one of my terrible jokes, when I see the sun setting and recall watching it with you in Moab. It has only been a week and a half, but it feels much longer. I meant what I said, Josephine. As soon as I can, I am coming back. Wait for me. Josephine read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and tucked it into the small trunk where she kept her few possessions. She immediately sat down to write a reply, telling him about her work at the store, about the people she was meeting in Moab, about how much she missed their evening walks and conversations. She mailed it the next morning and tried not to count the days until his next letter would arrive. A pattern developed over the following weeks. Hayes would write, and Josephine would respond. His letters grew longer and more detailed, full of observations about ranch life and questions about her days. He told her about his father's health, which was not as robust as it once was, and his growing sense that he might need to stay in Wyoming longer than he had originally planned. Josephine wrote back with understanding and encouragement, even as her heart sank at the thought of him being delayed. But it was in their letters that Josephine truly came to know Hayes Dalton. In writing, he was more open, more vulnerable than he had been in person. He wrote about his doubts and fears, about his sense of responsibility to his father and the ranch, about his dreams for the future. And Josephine found herself responding in kind, sharing parts of herself she had never shared with anyone. She told him about the loneliness of her childhood, about her complicated feelings toward her father, about her hopes of one day being truly independent. "I think," she wrote in one letter, "that I am becoming the person I always wanted to be, working at the store, supporting myself, making my own choices. It is hard sometimes, and there are days when I am so tired I can barely stand, but it is also exhilarating. For the first time in my life, I belong to myself. Does that make sense?" Hayes's reply came quickly. "It makes perfect sense. That is exactly how I felt when I first started working the ranch for real, not just as the boss's son, but as a working cowhand earning my place. There is something powerful about knowing you built something with your own hands and your own effort. You should be proud, Josephine. I am proud of you." As September turned to October and the weather began to cool, Josephine had been in Moab for almost 2 months. She had become a fixture in the town, known and liked by nearly everyone. She attended church services on Sundays, helped organize a harvest dance at the community hall, and even began teaching reading to some of the local children on Saturday mornings. Moab had stopped feeling like a temporary refuge and started feeling like home, but she missed Hayes with an ache that sometimes took her breath away. She had received 14 letters from him now, each one precious. She kept them all in her trunk, tied together with a ribbon she had bought at the store. Sometimes, on lonely evenings, she would take them out and read through them, tracing his words with her fingers and imagining his voice speaking them. Then, in early October, a letter arrived that was different from the others. Hayes's handwriting looked hurried, and the letter was short. "Josephine," it read, "my father suffered a heart episode last week. He is recovering, but the doctor says he cannot continue running the ranch as he has been. He needs to retire, truly retire, which means someone needs to take over his operations here. I am his only child, and the responsibility falls to me. I have been trying to figure out a way around this, a way to fulfill my duty to him while also keeping my promise to you, but I cannot see a solution. I am so sorry, Josephine. I do not know when I will be able to come back to Moab. Please know that this does not change how I feel about you. If anything, being apart from you these past months has only made me more certain. I think I am falling in love with you, Josephine Bailey. I think I have been falling in love with you since the moment I saw you stumbling through the desert. But I do not know what to do about it. What kind of man asks a woman to wait indefinitely? What kind of future can I offer you when I am tied to a ranch in Wyoming? I do not have answers to these questions. I only know that the thought of losing you makes me feel like I cannot breathe. Write to me, please, even if it is to tell me to leave you alone so you can move on with your life. I need to know what you are thinking. Yours always, Hayes." Josephine read the letter sitting on her bed in her small room, and when she finished, she simply sat there staring at the words. "I think I am falling in love with you. Her heart was racing, and she felt simultaneously elated and devastated. Hayes loved her, or was falling in love with her at least. But he was trapped in Wyoming by duty and responsibility, unable to come back to her. She thought about what she should do. The sensible thing would be to write back and gently break things off. It was not fair to either of them to continue this way, building feelings through letters when they might not see each other for months or even years. Hayes had his own life to live, his own responsibilities. She should set him free to find someone else, someone who could be there with him in Wyoming. But Josephine discovered she was not feeling particularly sensible. She loved Moab, loved her work and her new life here, but she loved Hayes Dalton more. The realization crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She had known him for only 5 days in person, had been exchanging letters with him for 2 months, and yet she knew with absolute certainty that he was the person she wanted to build a life with. The question was what to do about it. She went to see Sarah the next morning before the store opened. Her friend was in the back room, unpacking a new shipment of dry goods, and she looked up in surprise when Josephine entered. "You are here early. Everything all right? I need advice," Josephine said. "And I think you are the only person in Moab who might understand." Sarah set down the box she was holding and gave Josephine her full attention. "What is going on?" Josephine handed her Hayes's letter and waited while Sarah read it, watching her friend's expression shift from concern to understanding. "Oh, honey," Sarah said when she finished. "You love him." "I do," Josephine admitted. "Which is insane, because I barely know him and he is in Wyoming dealing with his father and the ranch, and I have this whole new life here that I have worked so hard to build. But I do. I love him, Sarah, and I do not know what to do about it." Sarah handed the letter back and was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. Then she said, "What do you want to do? If there were no obstacles, no concerns, what would you do?" "I would go to him," Josephine said immediately. "I would go to Wyoming and tell him that I love him and that we will figure out the rest together somehow." "Then why do you not do that?" Sarah asked. "Because I have only been supporting myself for 2 months," Josephine said. "Because I finally have some independence and security. Because running off after a man seems like exactly the kind of thing I was trying to escape when I left Santa Fe. Because what if I get there and it does not work out? I would have given up everything for nothing." "Those are all valid concerns," Sarah said. "But let me ask you this. Are you happy here in Moab? Really happy?" Josephine opened her mouth to say yes, then hesitated. "I was, or I thought I was. I like the work and I like the people. But lately, everything feels hollow somehow, like I am just going through the motions." "Because you are missing something," Sarah said gently. "Or someone, rather. Josephine, I know you are trying to be practical and sensible, but sometimes the heart wants what it wants. And from where I am standing, your heart wants Hayes Dalton. But what about the store? You need me here." Sarah smiled. "I will survive. I ran this store alone before you came, and I can do it again if I need to, though I will miss you terribly. But you cannot build your life around what I need or what Moab needs. You have to do what is right for you. What if I am making a mistake?" Josephine asked quietly. "What if you are not?" Sarah countered. "Josephine, when my husband died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would never be happy again, never feel whole again. And maybe I will not the way I was before. But I have learned that love is precious and rare, and when you find it, you should hold on to it with both hands. You found love with Hayes. Do not let it slip away because you are afraid." Josephine felt tears threatening. "I am terrified." "Good," Sarah said, pulling her into a hug. "That means it matters. Now go write that man a letter and tell him you are coming to Wyoming." It took Josephine 3 hours and 4 attempts to write the letter. She kept trying to find the right words, kept crossing things out and starting over. Finally, she simply wrote from the heart. "Hayes," the letter began, "I am coming to Wyoming. I do not know what that means for us or what the future holds, but I know that I love you. I think I started falling in love with you that first day in the desert when you gave me your horse without a second thought. I fell more in love with you during those 5 perfect days in Moab. And I have continued falling in love with you through every letter you have sent. I do not need promises or guarantees. I do not need you to have all the answers. I just need to be where you are. I will leave Moab as soon as I can make arrangements. Wait for me this time. Love, Josephine." She mailed the letter that afternoon and then went to tell Roy and Martha that she would be leaving. They took the news with good grace, though Martha hugged her tightly and made her promise to write. Josephine spent the next week preparing for her departure. Sarah helped her buy warmer clothes suitable for Wyoming winters and supplies for the journey. Roy arranged for her to travel with a wagon train heading north. A family named the Hendersons was relocating to Montana, and they were happy to have an extra person along, especially one who could help with the cooking and watching their 3 young children. The night before she was set to leave, Josephine lay in bed in her small room above the livery and thought about the past 2.5 months. She had come to Moab running from something, desperate and frightened. She was leaving Moab running towards something, towards someone, and while she was still frightened, it was a different kind of fear. The kind that came with hope. The journey to Wyoming took 3 weeks. The wagon train moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest the animals and make repairs. Josephine earned her passage by helping Mrs. Henderson with the children and cooking, and she discovered she had a knack for entertaining the little ones with stories and songs. The days were long and often tedious, the nights cold as they pushed further north, but Josephine did not mind. Every mile brought her closer to Hayes. She wondered if her letter had reached him yet, if he knew she was coming. Part of her wished she had waited for his reply before setting out, but another part was glad she had not. If he had tried to talk her out of it, to be noble and selfless and tell her not to come, she might have listened. This way, the decision was made. She was coming, and they would deal with the consequences together. The Hendersons were good traveling companions. Mr. Henderson was a quiet, steady man who had been a schoolteacher in Missouri before deciding to try his luck at farming in Montana. Mrs. Henderson was warm and practical, with a ready laugh and an endless supply of patience for her 3 rambunctious children. They asked Josephine about her reasons for going to Wyoming, and she told them a simplified version of the truth. She was going to see a man she had feelings for, a rancher she had met in Utah. "How long have you known him, Mrs. Henderson asked one evening as they sat by the fire while the children slept. "Not long," Josephine admitted. 5 days in person, 2 months through letters. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "I knew my Henry for 2 weeks before he proposed. Sometimes you just know, do you not, when something is right?" "I hope so," Josephine said. "I am gambling everything on it being right." "That is what love is," Mrs. Henderson said. "A gamble, but a worthwhile one." They reached the nearest town to Hayes's ranch on a cold afternoon in early November. The town was called Riverside, and it was smaller even than Moab. Just a handful of buildings clustered around a general store and post office. Mr. Henderson pulled the wagon up in front of the store, and Josephine climbed down with her bag, her legs shaky from weeks of riding. "Are you sure you will be all right from here?" Mrs. Henderson asked, looking worried. "I will be fine," Josephine assured her. "Thank you so much for everything. I could not have made this journey without you." She hugged the children goodbye, promised to write, and watched the wagon roll away toward Montana. Then she turned and headed into the general store, The proprietor was a middle-aged man with a friendly face and wire-rimmed spectacles. "Help you, miss?" "I am looking for the Dalton Ranch," Josephine said. "Can you tell me how to get there?" The man's eyebrows rose. "The Dalton Ranch. That is about 5 miles west of here. You have business with them." "I am here to see Hayes Dalton," Josephine said. "Can someone take me there, Hayes?" The man looked intrigued. "Well, I suppose I could have my son drive you out there. He was planning to head that way later this afternoon anyway. We have some supplies for the ranch." "That would be wonderful, thank you," Josephine said, relief flooding through her. The proprietor's son turned out to be a gangly youth of about 16 named Tom, who loaded Josephine and her bag into a wagon alongside several boxes of supplies. As they drove through the increasingly rugged terrain, Tom kept stealing curious glances at her. "You a friend of Hayes Dalton's, miss?" "Something like that," Josephine said. "He is a good man," Tom offered. "Since his father got sick, Hayes has been running that whole ranch pretty much by himself. Works from dawn until dark every day. Do not know when he sleeps, honestly." Josephine felt her heart clench. Hayes had not mentioned in his letters just how hard he was working, how much responsibility had fallen on his shoulders. She wondered if he had been trying to protect her from worrying. The Dalton Ranch appeared on the horizon as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. It was larger than Josephine had imagined, with a sprawling main house, several outbuildings and corrals holding dozens of horses and cattle. As Tom drove the wagon up to the main house, several ranch hands looked up from their work with curiosity. "Hayes around?" Tom called out to a man mending fence near the barn. "In the house with his father, I think," the man called back. "Want me to fetch him?" "That is all right," Josephine said, climbing down from the wagon before Tom could help her. "I can find him." She picked up her bag and walked toward the house on shaking legs. This was insane. She had traveled 3 weeks to get here to surprise a man who might not even want her to come. What if he had changed his mind? What if her letter had not reached him yet, and her appearance here was an unwelcome shock? What if the front door opened, and Hayes Dalton stepped out onto the porch? He had been carrying something, a piece of paper or letter maybe, but it dropped from his hands when he saw her. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Hayes was running, actually running down the porch steps and across the yard, and Josephine dropped her bag and ran to meet him. They collided in the middle of the yard, and Hayes swept her up in his arms, spinning her around. Josephine clutched at his shoulders, laughing and crying at the same time, and when he set her down, he immediately cupped her face in his hands. "You came," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Your letter just arrived yesterday. I was about to write back and tell you not to come, that I could not ask you to give up your life in Moab, but you are here. You are actually here." "I am here," Josephine confirmed, "and I am not going anywhere." Hayes kissed her then, properly and thoroughly, right there in the yard with Tom and the ranch hands watching. Josephine did not care. She had traveled 3 weeks to reach this moment, this man, and nothing else mattered. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Josephine Bailey. I should have said it in person before, but I was trying to be cautious and sensible. To hell with that. I love you. I think I have loved you since I saw you stumbling through that desert." "I love you too," Josephine said. "And you are right, to hell with being sensible. Sensible is overrated." Hayes laughed, the sound full of joy and relief. Then he sobered slightly. "You should know what you are getting into here. The ranch is struggling. My father's health is poor. I am working 18-hour days just to keep things afloat. I cannot offer you an easy life, Josephine. I cannot even promise that I will be able to give you the attention you deserve. It is going to be hard. Then it will be hard, Josephine said, but we will face it together. That is what love means, does it not? Facing the hard things together. Hayes pulled her close again, tucking her head under his chin. What did I do to deserve you? You gave me your horse and walked, Josephine said simply. And that told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man you are. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other as the sun set behind the mountains and the temperature dropped. Finally, Hayes pulled back. Come on. You must be freezing. Let me introduce you to my father, and then we will get you settled. Hayes's father, Hank Dalton, turned out to be a bear of a man, even diminished by illness. He sat in a chair by the fireplace in the main house, wrapped in blankets, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as Hayes led Josephine into the room. Pa, this is Josephine Bailey, the woman I told you about from Utah. The one whose horse died, Hank said, his voice gravelly. He looked Josephine up and down. You are prettier than Hayes described, though he did go on about you quite a bit. Talked my ear off about you, truth be told. Pa, Hayes said, a warning note in his voice. It is the truth, Hank said, but his eyes were kind. Welcome to the Dalton Ranch, Miss Bailey. I hope my son has explained what a mess you are walking into here. He has, Josephine said, finding her voice, and I am still here. Hank studied her for another moment, then nodded. Good. Hayes needs someone with backbone. Someone who will not cut and run when things get tough. You strike me as that type. I ran from an arranged marriage and crossed the desert alone, Josephine said. And then I traveled 3 weeks to get here. So yes, I suppose I have a bit of backbone. A slow smile spread across Hank's weathered face. I like her, Hayes. Do not let this one get away. I do not intend to, Hayes said, and the look he gave Josephine made her heart skip. Over the next few days, Josephine settled into life at the Dalton Ranch. Hayes set her up in a guest room in the main house, insisting on propriety even though she could see the longing in his eyes every time he said good night and left her at her door. During the day, she made herself useful however she could. She cooked meals for Hayes and his father, cleaned the house, and even helped with some of the ranch accounts when Hayes discovered she had a head for numbers. Where did you learn bookkeeping? He asked one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, going over ledgers by lamplight. My father insisted I have an education, Josephine said. He wanted me to be able to manage a household someday, which included managing its finances. Ironic, is it not? He taught me skills to be useful to a husband, and instead I used them to escape. Hayes reached over and took her hand. His loss is my gain. As the days turned into weeks, Josephine began to understand the full scope of what Hayes was dealing with. The ranch was indeed struggling, stretched thin by years of drought and bad cattle prices. Hank's illness had come at the worst possible time, leaving Hayes to manage everything alone with only a handful of ranch hands who were loyal but overworked. Hayes was up before dawn and often did not come in until well after dark, and even then he would spend hours going over accounts and planning the next day's work. Josephine did what she could to help. She took over all the household duties, freeing up the time Hayes had been spending on cooking and cleaning. She organized the accounts in a way that made them easier to track. She even learned to ride again, borrowing a gentle mare from the barn so she could help move cattle from one pasture to another. You do not have to do this, Hayes told her one evening when she came in muddy and exhausted from a day helping round up strays. I did not bring you here to work like a ranch hand. You did not bring me here at all, Josephine reminded him. I came of my own free will, and I want to help, Hayes. This is your life, which means it is my life too now. Hayes pulled her into his arms, heedless of the mud. I do not deserve you. Yes, you do, Josephine said. You deserve someone who will stand beside you, who will work as hard as you do, who will not give up when things get difficult. And that is exactly who I am. In December, as the first snows began to fall, Hayes proposed. It was not a romantic proposal, not the kind you would read about in novels. They were in the barn, checking on a mare who was about to foal, both of them tired and smelling of hay and horses. Hayes was adjusting the mare's blanket when he suddenly turned to Josephine and said, "Marry me." Josephine, who had been filling a water bucket, nearly dropped it. "What? Marry me?" Hayes repeated. He came over to her, taking the bucket and setting it aside. "I know this is not romantic. I know I should probably wait until I can offer you a better life, until the ranch is on solid footing again. But I do not want to wait, Josephine. I want you to be my wife. I want to build this life with you, to face whatever comes next together. Will you marry me?" Josephine felt tears spring to her eyes. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Hayes kissed her there in the barn with the pregnant mare looking on placidly. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, Hayes said, "I do not have a ring yet." "I will get you one, I promise, but with everything going on—" "I do not need a ring," Josephine interrupted. "I just need you." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Riverside. The only witnesses were Hank Dalton, Tom and his father from the general store, and a few of the ranch hands. Josephine wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, had loaned her. Hayes wore his best suit, which was slightly too big on him after months of hard work and not enough meals. But when Hayes slipped a plain gold band onto Josephine's finger and promised to love her in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them, she had never been happier. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Hayes kissed her, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the hard times ahead, it was worth it for this man, this moment, this love. The winter was hard. Hank's health continued to decline, and by February it was clear he did not have much time left. Josephine spent long hours sitting with him, reading aloud from his favorite books or just keeping him company. He told her stories about Hayes as a boy, about his late wife, about building the ranch from nothing. "Take care of him," Hank said to her one evening when Hayes was out checking on the animals. "My son is strong, but he feels things deeply. When I am gone, he is going to blame himself, going to think he should have done more. Do not let him carry that burden alone." "I won't," Josephine promised. "We will carry it together." Hank died peacefully in his sleep on a cold night in March. Hayes took it hard, just as his father had predicted. He threw himself even more deeply into work, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion. Josephine worried about him, but she also understood. Hayes needed to grieve in his own way, and work was how he processed his pain. But she made sure he did not do it alone. She worked beside him during the day and held him at night when the grief overwhelmed him. She listened when he needed to talk and sat in companionable silence when he did not. Slowly, gradually, Hayes began to heal. Spring brought new challenges but also new hope. The ranch hands, who had been uncertain about the future, agreed to stay on now that Hayes was officially in charge. The winter had been mild, which meant they had not lost as many cattle as feared. And in April, Josephine discovered she was pregnant. She told Hayes one evening after supper. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Josephine simply reached over and took his hand. "I am going to have a baby," she said. Hayes turned to look at her, his eyes wide. "You are certain, doctor?" "Patterson confirmed it yesterday when I rode into town. I am about 2 months along, he thinks. The baby should come in October." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Josephine felt a flicker of fear. Was he not happy? Was this too much, too soon given everything else they were dealing with. Then Hayes stood, pulled her to her feet and spun her around just as he had that first day she arrived at the ranch. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with tears. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "Josephine, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked. "Happy?" Hayes laughed. "I am terrified and overwhelmed and happier than I have any right to be. A baby, Josephine. A family. After everything, we are going to have a family." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Josephine refused to slow down despite Hayes's protests. She continued working around the ranch, managing the household and helping with the accounts. By summer, her condition was obvious, and the ranch hands treated her with a sort of reverent caution that she found both touching and amusing. In July, help arrived in the form of Hayes's cousin, a woman named Elizabeth who had heard about Hank's death and Hayes's new marriage. She appeared at the ranch one afternoon with her 2 teenage sons, announcing that they were staying for the summer to help out. "You cannot run this place alone, Hayes," Elizabeth said firmly. "And with Josephine expecting, you need more hands. My boys are strong and good workers, and I can help around the house." Elizabeth's arrival was a godsend. With her help, Josephine was able to rest more during the latter months of her pregnancy. The extra hands meant Hayes could finally delegate some work, could occasionally take an evening off to sit with his wife and talk about their hopes for their child. "I hope it is a boy," Hayes said one night in August as they lay in bed, his hand resting on Josephine's swollen belly. "Someone to carry on the ranch." "I hope it is healthy," Josephine countered. "Boy or girl, as long as the baby is healthy, that is all that matters." The baby, as it turned out, was a boy. He arrived on a crisp October morning, yelling lustily to announce his presence to the world. Hayes was at Josephine's side through the whole ordeal, holding her hand and looking nearly as terrified as she felt. But when Dr. Patterson placed the squalling infant in Hayes's arms, the look on her husband's face made every moment of pain worthwhile. "He is perfect," Hayes whispered, staring down at his son with wonder. "Josephine, he is perfect." They named him Henry, after Hayes's father, with the middle name of Joseph after Josephine. Little Henry Dalton was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair. Josephine had never known she could love anything as much as she loved her son, had never imagined the fierce protective instinct that motherhood would awaken in her. Hayes was a devoted father, carving out time from his work to hold his son, to sing to him in a surprisingly good baritone, to simply sit and watch him sleep. On the nights when Henry woke crying, Hayes would get up with Josephine, walking the floor with the baby while she settled back into bed. "You do not have to do that," she told him one night. "You have to be up early for work." "I want to," Hayes said, gently bouncing Henry in his arms. "I miss so much time with my own father because of work. I do not want to miss this." Elizabeth and her sons stayed through the fall, helping with the roundup and preparing the ranch for winter. Before they left in November, Elizabeth pulled Josephine aside. "You have been good for Hayes," she said. "When I arrived in July, he looked 10 years older than he should, worn down by responsibility and grief. Now he looks young again, happy. That is because of you and that baby." "It is because of all of us," Josephine said. "This ranch, this life, it is more than any one person can manage alone. We all need help sometimes." "True enough," Elizabeth said. "But Hayes is lucky to have you, Josephine. He knows that too, in case you wondered." After Elizabeth left, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. The work was still hard, but with good management and a bit of luck, the ranch slowly began to turn a profit again. Hayes hired a young man named Daniel to help with the day-to-day operations, giving himself more time to spend with Josephine and Henry. Years passed in this way, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their growing family. When Henry was 2, Josephine gave birth to a daughter they named Lucy, after Hayes's mother. Lucy was followed 3 years later by another son, Thomas. And then, when Josephine thought they were surely done having children, a surprise baby girl named Sarah, after Josephine's friend in Moab. The ranch prospered under Hayes's management. The hard times of those first years gave way to stability and eventually success. They built a new barn, expanded the house, hired more ranch hands. Hayes's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher spread, and the Dalton Ranch became one of the most respected operations in the territory. But through it all, Hayes never forgot where he came from or what was important. He made time for his children, teaching them to ride and work cattle, but also emphasizing the importance of education and treating people with kindness. He made time for Josephine, still courting her even after years of marriage, with little gestures and quiet moments stolen from busy days. "You ever regret it?" he asked her one evening when they were sitting on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Henry was teaching Lucy to rope a fence post while baby Thomas toddled after them. "Leaving Moab, giving up that independence you worked so hard for," Josephine looked at him in surprise. "Not for a single moment. Why would you even ask that?" "I just wanted to make sure," Hayes said. "You gave up a lot to come here. Your own life, your own work. Sometimes I worry that you might feel trapped." "Hayes Dalton," Josephine said firmly, "I have never felt more free than I do right here with you and our children. Independence is not about being alone or doing everything yourself. It is about making your own choices and living with them. I chose you. I chose this life, and I would make the same choice 1,000 times over." Hayes pulled her close and kissed her temple. "I love you, Josephine Dalton." "And I love you," she said. The children grew. Henry developed his father's quiet strength and his mother's head for numbers, taking to the business side of ranching with enthusiasm. Lucy was wild and spirited, more comfortable on horseback than anywhere else, and from an early age, she declared she was going to be a rancher when she grew up, not a rancher's wife. Thomas was gentle and thoughtful, with a gift for training horses that had experienced ranch hands shaking their heads in wonder. And Sarah, the baby, was everyone's favorite, equally at home in the house helping her mother or outside helping her father and siblings. As the children got older, Josephine began teaching at the small school that had been established in Riverside. She found she loved working with children, loved watching their faces light up when they mastered a new skill or understood a difficult concept. Hayes supported her work completely, just as she had always supported his, and they made it work by sharing household duties and childcare. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Hayes surprised Josephine by taking her back to Utah. They left the children with Elizabeth for a week and traveled south, retracing the route Josephine had taken all those years ago. They stopped in Moab, where Sarah Kemp still ran her general store, though she was older now and had taken on a young woman as an assistant. Sarah hugged Josephine tightly when they arrived. "Look at you, married with 4 children. I knew you and Hayes would work out." "How did you know?" Josephine asked, laughing. "Because I saw the way you looked at each other," Sarah said, "like you had found something precious and rare." And you had. They spent 2 days in Moab, visiting with Sarah and walking the familiar streets. On their last afternoon, Hayes rented horses and they rode out into the desert, following the old trail Josephine had taken that fateful day when her horse died. "It was somewhere around here," Josephine said, reining in her mare. The landscape looked the same, endless red rock and scrub brush, beautiful and desolate. I was sure I was going to die. And then I found you, Hayes said, pulling his horse alongside hers. The best thing that ever happened to me. I think about that day sometimes, Josephine said, about how easily things could have gone differently. If you had taken a different route, if I had given up and laid down to die, if you had not been the kind of man who would give a stranger his horse. Our entire life together hinged on that one moment. I do not think so, Hayes said. I think if it had not happened then, it would have happened some other way. We were meant to find each other, Josephine. I believe that. They sat on their horses in the desert as the sun began to set, casting everything in shades of gold and amber, and Josephine thought about fate and choice and love. She thought about the frightened young woman she had been, fleeing an arranged marriage with no real plan beyond survival. She thought about the cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known she was praying. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Hayes looked at her quizzically. "For what?" "For giving me your horse," Josephine said. "For walking. For being exactly who you are." Hayes reached over and took her hand. "Thank you for stumbling into my life in the middle of the desert. For taking a chance on a struggling rancher with more problems than prospects. For building this life with me." They rode back to Moab as darkness fell, hand in hand, partners in every sense of the word. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. They lost friends to illness and old age. They weathered droughts and hard winters. But through it all, Hayes and Josephine faced everything together, just as they had promised. The ranch continued to prosper, and eventually, Henry took over more and more of the day-to-day operations, allowing Hayes and Josephine to slow down a bit. Lucy, true to her childhood declaration, married a neighboring rancher and ran her own operation with fierce competence. Thomas started a horse breeding program that became renowned throughout the territory. And Sarah, the surprise baby, surprised them all by going to college and becoming a teacher, eventually taking over the school in Riverside where her mother had taught for so many years. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Hayes and Josephine sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the mountains just as they had done thousands of times before. They were older now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. 40 years, Hayes marveled. It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. "I know what you mean," Josephine said. She was rocking gently in her chair, a quilt across her lap that Sarah had made for them as an anniversary gift. "Sometimes I feel like that girl in the desert was a completely different person, and then sometimes I feel like it all happened yesterday." "You have any regrets?" Hayes asked. It was a question he had asked her periodically throughout their marriage, always needing reassurance, always wanting to be sure she was happy. "Only one," Josephine said, and when Hayes looked at her with concern, she smiled. "I regret that I did not meet you sooner. I wish we had more than 40 years together. I wish we had forever." Hayes reached over and took her hand, his grip still strong despite his years. "We have forever, Josephine. Maybe not in this life, but somewhere, somehow we have forever. I am sure of it." Their children threw them a party that evening, with all the grandchildren in attendance. There were 12 of them now, ranging in age from 21 down to 5, and they brought chaos and joy in equal measure. After dinner, as everyone sat around the big table in the ranch house, the same table where Hayes and Josephine had gone over accounts and made plans for so many years, Henry raised his glass. "To my parents," he said, "who built not just a ranch but a legacy, who showed us what love and partnership and hard work can accomplish. Thank you for everything you have given us, for the example you have set, for the life you have built together. Here is to 40 more years." "Hear, hear," everyone chorused, And Hayes and Josephine looked at each other across the table, their eyes shining with happy tears. Later, when all the guests had left and the house was quiet, Hayes and Josephine walked out to the barn together. It was a clear night, the sky thick with stars, and Artemis, now ancient but still alive, nickered softly when he saw them. "You remember when I gave you this horse?" Hayes asked, running his hand along the buckskin's neck. "You thought I was crazy." "You were crazy," Josephine said. "Who gives their horse to a complete stranger?" "Someone who was already a little bit in love," Hayes said. "I took one look at you, dusty and determined and refusing to give up, and I just knew you were going to be important in my life." "I fell in love with you in that moment too," Josephine admitted. "Or maybe I fell in love with who you were, the kind of man who would make that sacrifice without hesitation. Either way, my heart knew before my head caught up." They stood in the barn, leaning against each other, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and leather and horses. Outside, the wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. It was the same and yet different from that night so many years ago when Hayes had proposed in this very barn. "We had a good life," Hayes said. "Have," Josephine corrected. "We are not done yet." "Have," Hayes agreed with a smile. "We have a good life." In truth, they had several more good years together. They became great-grandparents, saw the ranch continue to grow and prosper under Henry's management, celebrated Sarah's wedding to a fellow teacher from Riverside. Hayes's health began to fail slowly, his body worn out from a lifetime of hard work, but his mind remained sharp and his love for Josephine unwavering. "You will be all right," he told her one afternoon when they both knew his time was running short. "You are the strongest person I have ever known, Josephine. You survived the desert, you survived building a life from nothing, you will survive this too." "I do not want to survive without you," Josephine said, her voice breaking. "I know," Hayes said gently, "but you will. For our children and grandchildren, for the life we built together, you will survive and you will thrive and you will be happy again. Promise me." "I promise," Josephine whispered, though she could not imagine how she would keep that promise. Hayes Dalton died peacefully in his sleep on a warm summer night, surrounded by his family. He was 73 years old and had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the territory, friends and neighbors and former ranch hands who had worked for Hayes over the years, all coming to pay their respects to a man who had been kind and fair and honest in all his dealings. Josephine grieved, but she also remembered her promise. She continued to live at the ranch, helping Henry with the accounts and teaching her great-grandchildren to read. She attended church on Sundays and had coffee with the other widows in town. She kept Hayes's memory alive by telling stories to anyone who would listen about the cowboy who had given her his horse and walked. On what would have been their 48th wedding anniversary, Josephine rode out into the hills alone, something she had not done in years. She followed the old trails Hayes had shown her, visiting all their favorite spots. As the sun began to set, she dismounted at the highest point on the ranch, where you could see for miles in every direction. She stood there looking out over the land that she and Hayes had built together, at the house where they had raised their children, at the barns and corrals and pastures that represented a lifetime of work and love. And she smiled, because she realized Hayes had been right. She had survived, and she had even in her own way thrived. The grief was still there, would always be there, but so was the joy of having loved and been loved so completely. "Thank you," she said aloud to the wind, to the sky, to Hayes wherever he was. "Thank you for stopping that day in the desert. Thank you for walking. Thank you for 47 years of partnership and love. Thank you for our life together." She mounted her horse and rode back to the ranch as darkness fell, at peace with her past and ready for whatever time remained to her. Josephine lived to be 89 years old, active and engaged until almost the very end. She died quietly one winter morning, sitting in her favorite chair by the fireplace with a book open in her lap. Henry found her there, looking peaceful, and he knew immediately that she was gone. They buried her next to Hayes on a hillside overlooking the ranch. The whole family gathered, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to say goodbye to the matriarch who had shaped all their lives. Sarah, now in her 50s and the family historian, gave the eulogy. "My mother was the bravest person I ever knew," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled mourners. "She left everything she knew to escape a terrible situation. She crossed a desert alone, and when a cowboy gave her his horse and walked, she did not just accept his help. She fell in love with him, and she built a life with him that became the foundation for all of us standing here today. She taught us about courage and love and perseverance. She taught us that family is not just about blood, but about the bonds we choose to create. She taught us that it is never too late to start over, to take a chance on love, to bet everything on a future you can barely imagine. And she lived what she taught. Every single day of her life, she lived it with grace and strength and an open heart. We will miss her terribly, but we will honor her by living the way she taught us to live." After the funeral, the family gathered at the ranch house for a meal, as was traditional. Henry stood at the head of the table, in the spot where Hayes had always sat, and he looked around at the assembled family. "I think," he said, "we should tell the story, the way Mom and Dad would want it told. For the great-grandchildren, and for any future generations who might forget where we came from." And so they told it, passing the narrative from person to person, each contributing the pieces they knew. They told about Josephine fleeing Santa Fe, about her horse dying in the desert. They told about Hayes appearing on his buckskin gelding, about his decision to give Josephine his horse and walk to Moab. They told about Josephine traveling to Wyoming, about their marriage and struggles and eventual success. But most of all, they told about the love story. About two people who met by chance and chose each other again and again, every single day, through hardships and triumphs, until death finally parted them. They told it as a reminder and a legacy, so that future generations would know that the foundation of their family was not just land or money or a successful ranch. It was love, the kind of love that gives without expecting return, the kind that walks through the desert beside you even when it would be easier to ride. And as the story ended and the family began to disperse, the oldest great-grandchild, a girl of 16 named Josephine after her great-grandmother, stood looking at the portrait of Hayes and Josephine that hung in the main room. It had been painted on their 25th anniversary, and it showed them in their prime, standing side by side with the ranch spread out behind them. But what caught Josephine's eye was the way they were looking at each other, with a depth of love and understanding that transcended the canvas. "That is what I want," she said to her grandfather Henry, who had come to stand beside her. "When I grow up, I want a love like that." Henry smiled and put his arm around his granddaughter's shoulders. "Then remember their story. Remember that real love is about sacrifice and partnership. Remember that the best things in life are worth taking risks for. And remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is offer someone your horse and walk." The young Josephine nodded solemnly, and in that moment, Henry knew that the legacy of Hayes and Josephine Dalton would continue, passed down through generations, a testament to the power of love and kindness and human connection. Years turned into decades, and the Dalton Ranch continued to prosper under the stewardship of Henry and then his children. The story of Hayes and Josephine became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and holidays. And while the details might have gotten a bit embellished over time, the heart of the story remained true. It was a story about a woman who was stranded when her horse died, about a cowboy who gave her his horse and walked, about how that single act of kindness sparked a love that lasted a lifetime and created a family that would endure for generations. It was a story about the American West, about hardship and survival and building something from nothing. But most of all, it was a story about love, pure and simple, the kind of love that changes lives and creates legacies. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Hayes and Josephine Dalton had lived and they had loved, and they had built something beautiful that would outlast them both. Their story would be told around tables and campfires for generations to come. A reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the simplest acts of kindness, and that true love is always worth walking through the desert for.